"He's just a waiter," my son-in-law proclaimed to the wedding guests, pointing at me with contempt as if I were invisible in his world of Silicon Valley elite. The guests nodded as I silently refilled their champagne glasses, but when someone suddenly exclaimed, "My God, that's him! He's on television!" my son-in-law's crystal glass shattered on the marble floor. That moment changed everything forever. Marcus Sterling stood at the head table, tapping his wine glass with a silver spoon as 200 of Silicon Valley's most powerful people turned their attention toward him. I continued moving between tables, champagne bottle in hand, invisible in my black vest and white shirt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily across the Heritage Club's private dining room. "Thank you all for sharing this incredible evening with Emma and me." I paused near a corner table, waiting for the traditional toast to conclude so I could continue serving his important guests. Senator Hayes sat nearby discussing policy with a Federal Reserve Board member. Tech mogul Sarah Chen was deep in conversation with investment banker Catherine Moore. "Success in life comes from understanding your place," Marcus continued, his tone shifting from celebration to something harder. "We've invited people tonight who represent excellence, achievement, the very best of what our society offers." Something cold settled in my stomach as his gaze found me across the room. "Which makes it important to acknowledge different levels of contribution. Not everyone reaches the same heights. Not everyone matters equally." Marcus pointed directly at me, causing every head in the room to turn. "Take this man, for instance. Robert Mitchell. He's just a waiter. Never amounted to anything significant. Never built anything lasting. A man who peaked in his 20s and has spent 40 years sliding downward." The champagne bottle felt impossibly heavy in my hands. Emma's face had gone white, her eyes wide with horror. Around the room, guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. "He wants to be part of this celebration," Marcus's voice grew stronger. "But the truth is, there are makers and there are servers, leaders and followers, people who matter and people who simply exist to facilitate the lives of those who do." I set the champagne bottle on the nearest table with careful precision. When I spoke, my voice carried clearly across the silent room. "Would anyone like more champagne?" The simple question, delivered with perfect composure, seemed to break Marcus's momentum. But then someone near the television above the bar pointed excitedly at the screen. "But let me back up and tell you how I ended up serving champagne at my own daughter's wedding, while her husband publicly humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. 3 days earlier, I'd driven to Marcus Sterling's $8.5 million house in Palo Alto, carrying an antique wooden box that felt heavier in my weathered hands than it should have. His marble foyer stretched before me like a museum exhibition, all sharp edges and cold surfaces designed to make visitors feel small. "Dad, you made it," Emma said, appearing from the kitchen with a smile that seemed forced. She kissed my cheek, her eyes immediately drawn to the wrapped box. "What's that?" "Your great-grandfather's compass," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Thought you might want it for the wedding. It's guided our family through difficult times for 3 generations. And the brass compass had belonged to my grandfather, then my father, each man using its moral guidance to navigate life's storms. Not a magnetic compass, but something far more valuable. A symbol of principles that had guided our family through wars, economic hardships, and countless personal challenges." Marcus emerged from his living room like he owned the world, which he essentially did. Wineglass already in hand, expensive suit perfectly tailored, he surveyed me like I was tracking mud across his Persian rug. "Robert," his handshake was brief, dismissive. Still working at that restaurant downtown. The Heritage Club, yes. Vincent's been good to me for 15 years. What's in the box? When I unwrapped the brass compass, Emma's eyes widened with genuine appreciation. But Marcus barely glanced at it before waving it away. Antique. Probably worth something to a collector. The casual dismissal stung. Before I could explain its significance, his assistant called from the dining room. "Dinner's ready, Mr. Sterling." We moved to his dining room, another showcase of wealth. The mahogany table could have seated 12 people, but tonight it was set for 3 with place settings that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "So," I began, "the wedding planning must be exciting. How many guests are you expecting?" Marcus cut his Wagyu steak with surgical precision. "We're keeping it intimate but influential. Close friends, key business partners, people shaping the future of American technology." He began listing names like reading from Forbes magazine. "Senator William Hayes will be attending along with Sarah Chen from Chen Ventures. Dr. James Wilson from the Federal Reserve confirmed yesterday. Catherine Moore from Goldman Sachs." Each name meant nothing to me, but Emma nodded with recognition. These were her people now. "David Thompson, the former Treasury Secretary, is flying in from Washington," Marcus added. "And naturally, several Supreme Court justices will be in attendance." "That sounds wonderful," I said, taking a bite of the most expensive beef I'd ever tasted. The conversation continued around me like I was observing rather than participating. Wedding venues costing more than houses, catering, involving chefs flown in from Europe, flower arrangements requiring teams of designers. Marcus's responses to my contributions grew shorter with each exchange. His glances became more pointed, like he was studying a problem that needed solving. Finally, Marcus set down his silverware with deliberate precision. "Robert, there's something we need to discuss." Emma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Marcus, please. Not tonight." "It's about the wedding. I've been giving serious thought to the guest list, the atmosphere we want to create." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What about it?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, completely comfortable in his domain. "My guests represent the pinnacle of American innovation and policy making. Tech executives reshaping global commerce, venture capitalists funding the future senators writing laws that govern our economy. This isn't just a wedding celebration, Robert. It's a networking opportunity that could influence American technology for the next decade." "Marcus," Emma's voice carried a warning he ignored. "I need to be direct. You work as a waiter. These people move in circles where trillion-dollar decisions are made over handshakes, where casual conversations shift entire markets. Your presence would be problematic." The words hit like a physical blow. Silence settled heavy around the table. "That's my father," Emma said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "And I respect the role he's played in your life," Marcus replied smoothly. "But we need to be realistic. This wedding is an investment in our future in relationships that will define our success for decades." He stood with fluid grace. "I think we should continue this privately. Robert, would you join me on the terrace?" The sliding glass door closed behind us with a soft whisper, cutting off Emma's protests from inside the dining room. Marcus's terrace stretched across the back of his house like the deck of an expensive yacht, offering panoramic views of Silicon Valley lights below. Workers were busy in his garden, setting up white chairs in perfect rows, stringing lights between century-old oak trees. My daughter's wedding preparations, happening right in front of me, a celebration I was being told I couldn't attend. Marcus positioned himself against the railing, with practiced ease, the city lights providing a dramatic backdrop that emphasized his command of this moment. He looked like a man accustomed to difficult conversations, someone who'd delivered bad news to employees and competitors with the same calculated calm. "Beautiful view, isn't it?" He gestured toward the sprawling lights below us. This house cost me $8.5 million. Not because I needed something this large, but because location and presentation matter in my business. $8.5 million. The number hit me like a slap across the face. I'd never seen that much money in my entire lifetime, let alone owned property worth that amount. The wedding itself is running $500,000. Marcus continued, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. Flowers alone are $40,000. The security detail costs $25,000. Emma's dress was $18,000, and that's before alterations. Each figure was a reminder of the vast gulf between our worlds. I watched the workers below arranging chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent, preparing for a celebration that would cost more than I'd earned in the past 10 years combined. I paid for Emma's education, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. 4 years at Berkeley, worked double shifts, saved every tip so she could graduate debt-free. Helped with her apartment deposit when she moved out, co-signed for her first car. That was admirable. Marcus interrupted, his tone suggesting past generosity was irrelevant to present realities. But this is about the future, not the past. She's my responsibility now, and I won't allow anything to compromise the opportunities this wedding represents. Through the glass door, I could see Emma pacing in the dining room, her face twisted with worry as she watched our conversation unfold. She kept glancing toward us, but made no move to interrupt, perhaps understanding that some battles needed to be fought without interference. "She's my daughter," I said. "She's my fiancée." Marcus's voice was final. "And I won't let you turn her wedding into some pathetic statement about your wounded pride. This isn't about family sentiment, Robert. This is about protecting what matters." The workers below had nearly finished with the chairs, row after row of white seats all facing an altar where my daughter would marry this man where I wouldn't be allowed to sit. "You understand what I'm saying?" Marcus pressed. "These people I've invited, they're not just wealthy. They're the architects of American prosperity. Senator Hayes chairs the Technology Subcommittee. Sarah Chen's fund has backed every major tech IPO in the last decade. Dr. Wilson's Federal Reserve policies determine interest rates that affect millions of jobs." He moved closer, his voice dropping to ensure our conversation remained private. "Do you really think a waiter belongs in conversations about the future of artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency regulation, or space commerce? These people make decisions that shape civilizations. What would you contribute to those discussions?" The contempt in his voice was absolute. "I've worked too hard building relationships with these people to have them wondering why I'm associated with someone who serves them dinner at restaurants." "Fine." The word came out barely audible. "I won't come." Marcus's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "I'm glad we understand each other. This isn't personal, Robert. It's simply practical." I turned toward the door, the conversation clearly over. My reflection in the glass looked old, defeated. Behind me, Marcus remained at the railing, probably already planning which important person would sit in what should have been my seat. "Robert." His voice stopped me at the door. "Leave the compass. Emma shouldn't be burdened with reminders of complications." I paused, my hand on the door handle. The gift box felt impossibly heavy. Without looking back, I stepped inside, walking past Emma's questioning gaze, past the remnants of our unfinished dinner. I made it to the front door before Emma caught up with me. "Dad, wait." "It's fine, sweetheart." I kissed her forehead, still holding the unwrapped compass. "Congratulations on your engagement." I walked to my car without looking back, the weight of Marcus's dismissal settling into my bones like winter cold. The drive home took me through 3 different worlds. Marcus's neighborhood with its manicured lawns and electronic gates, gave way to middle-class suburbs, then finally to my part of town where apartment buildings crowded together, like old friends sharing space. My building had no doorman, no marble foyer, just a lobby with fluorescent lights and mailboxes that hadn't been painted in years. I climbed 2 flights of stairs, my legs feeling heavier with each step. Inside my 1-bedroom apartment, the silence was complete. No expensive artwork on the walls, no crystal glasses catching light from designer fixtures. Just photographs of Emma at various ages. Graduation birthdays, Christmas mornings when money was tight, but happiness was abundant. I set the compass box on my kitchen table and stared at it. My great-grandfather's moral compass passed down through 3 generations of men who'd tried to do right by their families. Worth something to a collector, Marcus had said, as if its only value was monetary. My phone buzzed. Emma's name appeared on the screen. "Dad." Her voice was thick with tears. "I'm so sorry about tonight." "It's okay, sweetheart." "It's not okay. Marcus had no right to talk to you like that. You're my father. You should be at my wedding." I closed my eyes, listening to her pain. "Sometimes life isn't fair, Emma, but I'll find a way to be there for you." How Marcus meant what he said. He won't change his mind. Through my bedroom window, I could see the lights of downtown, where the Heritage Club sat, among dozens of other restaurants, where I'd worked for 15 years, invisible in my black vest and white shirt. "Don't worry about it," I told her. "Just focus on being happy. That's all I've ever wanted." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness thinking about Marcus's words. "You serve food for a living," as if that made me less of a person, less worthy of witnessing my own daughter's wedding. I walked to my closet and pulled out my work uniform. Black pants, white shirt, black vest, the costume of invisibility that had become my daily armor. How many important dinners had I served? How many wealthy guests had I made comfortable while remaining utterly forgettable? The uniform felt different in my hands tonight. Not like a symbol of servitude, but like possibility. Marcus was right about one thing. I was just a waiter. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd forgotten that waiters are invisible. We move through important events, serving the powerful, witnessing their private moments. We're part of the scenery, essential but unnoticed. Tomorrow I would call Vincent and ask him a favor, not as Robert Mitchell, father of the bride, but as Robert Mitchell, experienced waiter, who knew how to disappear into any crowd. Saturday morning came too early. Sleep had been impossible, my mind cycling through Marcus's words, Emma's tears, the weight of what I was planning. By 8:30, I was dressed and driving toward the Heritage Club, the familiar route offering no comfort today. The restaurant looked different in morning light. Empty dining rooms always felt larger, more honest somehow. No guests to perform for, no masks to wear, just tables, chairs, and the quiet hum of preparation. Vincent's SUV sat in the staff parking lot. Good. I needed this conversation to happen before the lunch rush, before other servers arrived with their weekend energy and gossip. Inside, the coffee machine was already brewing. Vincent stood at the prep station slicing onions with mechanical precision, his weathered hands moving in practiced rhythm. 15 years of friendship had taught me to read his moods. Today, he seemed troubled. "You're early," he said without looking up. "Saturday shifts don't start until 10. Couldn't sleep. I poured coffee into 2 mugs, adding sugar to his the way he liked it. The ritual felt important, grounding. "Vincent, I need to ask you something." He accepted the coffee, finally meeting my eyes. Lines around them spoke of long nights and difficult decisions, the weight of keeping a family business alive in an expensive city. "What troubles you, my friend?" The words came harder than I'd expected. "Tomorrow is Emma's wedding." "Ah, yes. At that big house in Palo Alto. Very fancy. You must be proud. I am, but there's a problem. I leaned against the counter, choosing words carefully. Her fiancé doesn't want me there. Vincent's knife stopped moving. What do you mean? He thinks I'm not good enough for his guests. Too embarrassing. Just a waiter, he said. The silence stretched between us. Vincent set down his knife, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder. This man, he said slowly, he said this to you. Told me not to come to my own daughter's wedding. Vincent's hands clenched into fists. In his voice, I heard the echo of every slight he'd endured as a small business owner, every time someone had looked through him like he didn't matter. What kind of man turns away a father from his daughter's wedding? The kind who cares more about appearances than family. I took a deep breath. That's why I need your help. His eyebrows rose. What can I do? Hire me to work the wedding, just for tomorrow, one day. Vincent stared at me like I'd suggested robbing a bank. You want to work your own daughter's wedding, Robert? That's not right. A father should sit in the front row, not serve drinks to strangers. Sometimes we don't get what should be. We take what we can get. He returned to his onions cutting with more force than necessary. You really want to do this thing? I've never wanted anything more. Another long silence. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled past, starting their daily routes. Normal Saturday morning sounds for everyone except me. The catering company, Vincent said finally. They handle the service. But I know the manager, Giuseppe Torino. We worked together years ago. My chest tightened with hope. Would he add me to the crew? Yes, Giuseppe owes me favors. Vincent wiped his hands on his apron. You're sure about this, Robert? Once you start serving that man's guests, there's no going back. No dignity in retreat. My dignity isn't in question here. His is. Vincent studied my face, searching for doubt he wouldn't find. After 15 years, he knew my stubborn streak as well as anyone. Okay then. I'll call Giuseppe this morning. You'll work the wedding tomorrow. Relief flooded through me like warm coffee on a cold morning. Thank you, Vincent. I won't forget this. You're a good man, Robert Mitchell. If that fancy son-in-law can't see it, that's his blindness, not your fault. But Vincent's phone rang before I could respond. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Giuseppe, why are you calling so early? A pause. What, slow down, speak English? I watched Vincent's face change from confusion to alarm as he listened to rapid Italian on the other end. When did this happen? Another pause. No, don't do anything yet. I'll handle this. He hung up and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Robert, we have a problem. Someone called Giuseppe this morning. Offered him $25,000 cash to refuse any requests from me about tomorrow's wedding. The blood drained from my face. Marcus. Giuseppe's been in this business 40 years. He's never seen anything like it. Someone who really doesn't want you at that wedding. Vincent paced behind the counter, his anger building with each step. $25,000 to keep a father from his daughter's wedding. What kind of monster does this? The kind who thinks money solves everything, I said quietly. What did Giuseppe tell them? That's the beautiful part. Giuseppe hung up on them. Said his friendship with me isn't for sale at any price. Vincent's smile was grim but satisfied. Your son-in-law just made an enemy of the wrong Italian. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that made you grateful for warm houses and family gatherings. Too bad I wouldn't be welcome at either. But I had other plans. I dressed carefully in my best waiter's uniform, the navy blue one I'd worn to serve Nobel Prize winners and movie stars during my 15 years at the Heritage Club. Pressed and ready for the most important performance of my life. At exactly 11 o'clock, I arrived at Marcus's house to find organized chaos. 3 catering trucks filled his circular driveway, teams of workers transforming his garden into something that belonged on magazine covers. White roses cascaded from tall centerpieces, their petals catching the morning light like scattered diamonds. Giuseppe Torino greeted me at the service entrance, a weathered man in his 60s, who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd managed 1,000 events without a single failure. "You must be Robert," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Vincent speaks very highly of you. 15 years at the Heritage Club, that's impressive. Thank you for letting me join your crew today." Vincent said this was a family situation. Giuseppe's eyes held understanding without judgment. "We take care of family in this business. Besides, someone tried to buy my silence this morning. I don't like being bought." He handed me a crisp white shirt and black bow tie. "The guests start arriving at 5. Cocktail service begins immediately, dinner at 7. You'll be working the main dining room champagne and wine service." I changed in the service area, adjusting my bow tie in a mirror that reflected back a man I'd been 15 years ago. Professional, invisible, essential, but forgettable. The armor I'd worn through countless elegant evenings. By 4:30, the transformation was complete. Marcus's backyard had become something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from oak trees, their light creating dancing patterns on white tablecloths. A string quartet played softly near the altar, where Emma would say her vows in 30 minutes. I took my position near the champagne station, silver serving tray in hand, watching as the first guests arrived. They moved with the confident ease of people accustomed to wealth and influence. Designer gowns, handmade suits, jewelry that caught light like captured stars. Marcus appeared precisely at 5, resplendent in his custom tuxedo, greeting guests with practiced charm. His eyes swept the garden, ensuring everything met his exacting standards. When his gaze passed over me, there was no recognition, no suspicion. I was exactly what I appeared to be: professional service staff, invisible and forgettable. The ceremony began at 5:30. I watched from the service area as Emma walked down the aisle in her $18,000 dress, radiant, despite the complicated emotions swirling around her special day. Marcus beamed as he watched his bride approach, his satisfaction complete. In his mind, he'd eliminated every potential embarrassment, crafted the perfect networking event, disguised as a wedding celebration. The vows were traditional, beautiful, meaningless to anyone except the couple speaking them. When they kissed, the guests erupted in applause, and I felt my chest tighten with pride and sadness in equal measure. Now came the real test. The reception, where Marcus would discover that some fathers couldn't be bought, intimidated, or erased. Cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering champagne and canapés to guests who barely noticed my presence. Conversations swirled around me, deals being discussed over appetizers, policies being shaped between courses. "Excellent service, young man," an elderly gentleman in a perfectly tailored tuxedo said as I refilled his glass. "You carry yourself with real professionalism." "Thank you, sir," I replied, moving to the next table where Senator Hayes was discussing technology policy with a Federal Reserve Board member. This was my world now, moving through importance without being important, witnessing history without making it. The irony wasn't lost on me that these people who Marcus considered too elite for a simple waiter to meet were being served by someone they'd never remember. "More champagne?" I asked a distinguished woman in emerald silk who was deep in conversation with Sarah Chen about venture capital funding. "Please," she smiled warmly. "What lovely service. You're very attentive." I continued my rounds, ensuring water glasses stayed full and wine flowed freely. Giuseppe's team worked like a symphony orchestra, each person playing their part in perfect harmony. We were invisible but essential, the machinery that made elegant events possible. At the head table, Emma glowed with bridal happiness, while Marcus held court with his most important guests. Tech mogul Sarah Chen sat to his right discussing startup valuations, with the casual authority of someone who controlled billions. Investment banker Catherine Moore was analyzing Federal Reserve policy with Dr. Wilson, their conversation worth more than most people's annual salaries. These were the people Marcus had insisted were too important to meet a waiter. Yet here I was, serving them wine while they remained completely oblivious to who I really was. They discussed artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, regulations, space commerce, the exact topics Marcus had claimed I couldn't contribute to. "Excuse me," a young tech executive called out as I passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "These are incredible. What's in them?" "Smoked salmon with dill cream cheese on potato latkes, sir. The chef's specialty." "Outstanding. You know your menu well." I moved between tables with the same graceful efficiency I'd maintained for 15 years, each interaction courteous and professional. No one suspected that the man ensuring their comfort was anything more than skilled service staff. The evening progressed with clockwork precision. Each course appeared on schedule. Each glass was refilled before it emptied. Each guest's needs were anticipated and met. I caught Marcus glancing at me occasionally, but his expression showed only the satisfied confidence of someone whose event was proceeding flawlessly. He had no idea that the embarrassing father he'd banished was 30 feet away serving champagne to his precious VIP guests. The same people he'd claimed would be offended by my presence were now being attended to by me with complete professionalism. Dr. Wilson from the Federal Reserve caught my attention as I cleared his appetizer plate. "You run an excellent operation here. Very smooth service." "Thank you, sir. We pride ourselves on attention to detail." "It shows. This is exactly the kind of quality one expects at significant events." If only he knew how significant this event truly was for me. The father of the bride serving dinner to guests who had no idea they were witnessing a man's quiet rebellion against the son-in-law who'd tried to erase him. Marcus rose from his seat, wineglass in hand, preparing for the traditional toasts. I positioned myself near the service station, ready to refill glasses as needed. What happened next would determine whether my infiltration had been worth the risk. The room quieted as Marcus tapped his glass with a silver spoon, preparing to address his carefully curated audience. I continued polishing stemware, maintaining my invisible presence, while the man who'd humiliated me prepared to speak to the people he'd claimed I wasn't worthy to meet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. "Thank you all for sharing this incredible evening with Emma and me." I set down my polishing cloth and prepared for whatever came next, knowing that this moment would define everything that followed. The room filled with polite applause as Marcus smiled at his carefully curated audience. Emma beamed up at him from her seat, radiant in her wedding dress, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. "We're surrounded tonight by the people who matter most." Marcus continued, his tone warm and inclusive. "Colleagues who've built this community, friends who've supported our journey, family who've shaped our values." More applause rippled through the crowd. I continued moving between tables, champagne bottle in hand, invisible in my black vest and white shirt. Success in life. Marcus's voice began to shift, taking on the harder edge I recognized from our terrace conversation. "Comes from understanding your place, from recognizing what truly matters. We've invited people tonight who represent excellence, achievement, the very best of what our society offers." Something cold settled in my stomach as his gaze swept the room. This wasn't heading toward a traditional wedding toast. "Which makes it important," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength and authority, "to acknowledge different levels of contribution. Not everyone reaches the same heights. Not everyone matters equally." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The warm celebration was taking an unexpected turn towards something more pointed, more cruel. Take this man, for instance. Marcus's hand gestured directly at me, causing every head in the room to turn. Robert Mitchell, he's just a waiter, never amounted to anything significant, never built anything lasting. A man who peaked in his 20s and has spent 40 years sliding downward. The champagne bottle felt impossibly heavy in my hands. Emma's face had gone completely white, her eyes wide with horror as she realized what her new husband was doing to her father in front of 200 of Silicon Valley's most influential people. Around the room, guests exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the cruelty unfolding before them. This wasn't the warm, unifying message wedding toasts were supposed to deliver. He wants to be part of this celebration. Marcus's voice grew stronger, fed by the attention and his own sense of power. But the truth is, there are makers and there are servers, leaders and followers, people who matters, and people who simply exist to facilitate the lives of those who do. I set the champagne bottle on the nearest table with careful precision. My hands remained steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. Marcus, please stop. Emma's voice was barely audible, lost in the stunned silence that had fallen over the room. But Marcus was beyond stopping now, drunk on power and the intoxication of public dominance. Some people spend their lives dreaming of significance while others actually achieve it. The difference is fundamental, unchangeable, natural selection in action. I straightened my bow tie and smoothed my vest habits from another lifetime, asserting themselves automatically. The room had fallen into complete silence except for the soft clink of crystal and silver as other servers continued their work, uncertain whether to stop or continue. This man, Marcus pointed at me again, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room, represents everything that holds back human progress. Contentment with mediocrity, acceptance of limitation, the willingness to serve rather than lead. When I spoke, my voice carried clearly across the silent room, cutting through Marcus's monologue with quiet dignity. Would anyone like more champagne? The simple question, delivered with perfect composure, seemed to break Marcus's momentum. He stared at me across the dining room, perhaps expecting anger tears or defensive justification. Instead, he found the same professional courtesy I'd shown every guest that evening. A few people nodded mutely, grateful for any excuse to look away from the uncomfortable spectacle. I retrieved my bottle and continued my rounds, moving between tables with the same graceful efficiency I'd maintained all evening. Each pour was precise, each interaction courteous and warm. Marcus remained standing, his cruel toast hanging unfinished in the air. The words had achieved their purpose, establishing his dominance, demonstrating his power to humiliate without consequence. But something in my calm response seemed to rob him of the satisfaction he'd expected. An elderly woman near the window cleared her throat nervously. Perhaps we should continue with dinner now. Others murmured agreement, desperate for any escape from the moment. Emma pressed her napkin to her eyes, trying to preserve her makeup while processing the horror of what had just occurred on what should have been the happiest day of her life. I reached their table, last approaching, with the same professional demeanor I'd shown everyone else. More champagne for the bride and groom? Emma looked up at me with tears threatening to spill over. Though she couldn't speak openly, her eyes conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud. Marcus watched our exchange with narrowed eyes, perhaps realizing that his public attack had failed to break me as intended. If anything, my composure made his cruelty appear petty and small. The room buzzed with uncomfortable energy, guests struggling to process what they'd witnessed. Conversations restarted gradually, but the celebration's joy had been poisoned by Marcus's display of power and contempt. But then someone near the television above the bar suddenly pointed at the screen, their voice cutting through the awkward dinner conversation. "Wait a minute!" A young man in his 20s called out, his excitement breaking through the uncomfortable silence. "Look at the television!" Several guests turned toward the screen mounted above the bar, where the Heritage Club kept documentaries playing softly during events. The young man leaned forward, studying whatever had caught his attention, with growing amazement. "That's incredible," he said, his voice rising. "That's the same man." More heads turned now, following his gaze to the television. An elderly woman in pearls peered over her glasses at the screen, then at me, then back again, her face transformed with recognition and wonder. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "It really is him." The words spread through nearby tables like ripples on a pond. Guests began pulling out their phones, searching for something, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amazement. The uncomfortable energy from Marcus's toast was rapidly being replaced by something entirely different. "Ladies and gentlemen," the young man stood up, his excitement infectious, as more people turned their attention to whatever had captured his interest. "We have someone very special serving our champagne tonight." Marcus's confidence began to waver as he watched his carefully controlled evening slipping away from him. His face had gone pale, and he kept glancing between the television screen and me, trying to understand what was happening. "That's definitely him," another voice confirmed from across the room. "Same person, no question about it." I felt the weight of every gaze in the room settling on me like spotlights. The careful invisibility I'd maintained all evening was evaporating in real time, replaced by an attention I'd spent decades avoiding. Emma looked between the television and me with growing confusion, her tear-streaked face showing the dawning realization that something momentous was about to happen. Something that would completely transform how everyone in this room understood the quiet waiter who'd been serving their champagne. Whatever they were seeing on that screen, whatever had caused this sudden shift in the room's energy, was about to reveal secrets I'd kept hidden for 20 years. The comfortable anonymity of Robert Mitchell, waiter, was about to collide with a past that Marcus and his guests never could have imagined. The murmur of recognition grew stronger. Phones appeared throughout the room as guests began searching for confirmation of whatever they'd discovered. Marcus stood frozen at the head table, his cruel toast forgotten as his perfectly orchestrated evening began to unravel in ways he couldn't control or understand. The television continued playing, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its glow. But whatever documentary was showing had just connected my present to a past that would change everything. Economic geniuses who changed America. Someone read from their phone screen, their voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. A documentary about the brilliant minds whose policies shaped modern prosperity. My hands went still around the champagne bottle as the full scope of the revelation began to unfold. On the television screen, black and white footage showed a much younger version of myself standing behind presidential podiums, surrounded by charts and graphs that had once decided the fate of nations. "Robert Mitchell," a woman near the window said, reading from her phone with growing amazement. "Senior economic advisor to Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. Architect of the policies that created the technology boom of the 1990s. The words hit the room like physical blows. Marcus's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against his plate, with a sound that seemed to echo through the sudden quiet. His face had gone from pale to ashen as he stared at me across the dining room. "The man who saved 3 presidencies from economic disaster," another guest read aloud. "His policies prevented the recession of 1991, guided the dot-com expansion, and created the regulatory framework that allowed Silicon Valley to flourish." The irony was breathtaking. Every person in this room owed their fortune directly or indirectly to economic policies I'd helped design. The tech boom that had made Marcus wealthy the venture capital structures that funded Silicon Valley's growth, the regulatory frameworks that allowed innovation to flourish. All of it had passed through my hands during those intense years in Washington. Senator Hayes rose from his seat, recognition dawning in his eyes. Robert Mitchell, I remember now. You briefed the Senate Technology Committee in 1994. Your testimony about Internet infrastructure was brilliant. The Federal Reserve integration policies, Dr. Wilson added, his voice filled with professional respect. You wrote the framework we still use today for technology sector oversight. Sarah Chen was staring at her phone screen in disbelief. According to this, his venture capital regulations from 1996 are the foundation of modern startup funding. Every deal I've ever made was built on frameworks he created. The revelations spread through the room like wildfire. Phones emerged as guests searched for more information, their faces showing the gradual understanding that they'd been served by a legend. The quiet waiter who'd filled their glasses was someone who had shaped their entire world. Catherine Moore from Goldman Sachs, a voice called out. You must remember the 1995 Banking Reform Summit. Robert Mitchell was the keynote speaker about technology investment policy. Catherine's face had gone white. Of course. The Mitchell Doctrine for Tech Sector Investment. It's required reading for every analyst at our firm. Marcus remained frozen at the head table, his perfect wedding reception dissolving into chaos as his guests realized the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The man he'd publicly dismissed as worthless was someone they should have been honored to meet. The North American Free Trade Analysis, another guest added. The economic modeling that prevented the 1992 recession. The dot-com bubble prevention strategies. All Robert Mitchell's work. Emma's hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, not with shame but with dawning understanding. She was seeing her father's sacrifices through completely new eyes, comprehending the magnitude of what he'd given up for her future. I continued holding my champagne bottle, my movements unchanged despite the scrutiny. The young man on the television screen delivered policy briefings with passion and conviction, while the older man in the dining room simply did his job with quiet dignity. Why didn't you say anything? Senator Hayes asked, his tone carrying genuine respect rather than the casual dismissal Marcus had expected. I looked up from the table I was clearing, meeting his gaze with the same composure I'd maintained all evening. Tonight isn't about me. It's about Emma's happiness. The simple response seemed to deepen the room's fascination. Here was a man who had commanded the attention of presidents, who had been recognized and celebrated at the highest levels of government, now serving champagne without seeking recognition or special treatment. Around the room, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The same people who had witnessed my public humiliation were now looking at me with expressions of awe and respect. Marcus's carefully constructed narrative about makers and servers had crumbled in the face of the truth. The man he'd called a failure had achieved exactly the kind of historical significance he desperately craved. The waiter he'd dismissed as worthless had influenced their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. But the revelations weren't finished yet. Because there was one more secret that would complete Marcus's humiliation, one more truth that would show just how completely he'd misjudged the man he'd tried to destroy. Vincent Romano appeared from the kitchen entrance, drawn by the commotion in his dining room. His weathered face showed a mixture of pride and satisfaction as he surveyed the transformed atmosphere. 15 years of keeping my secret was about to end. Ladies and gentlemen, Vincent announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd run successful businesses for decades. I see you've discovered who Robert really is. The room fell silent again, all attention turning to the restaurant owner who'd clearly been part of this evening's hidden drama. What you don't know, Vincent continued, moving to stand beside me, is that Robert Mitchell isn't just our finest server. He's my business partner. He owns 50% of the Heritage Club restaurant group. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Marcus's mouth fell open as he processed what Vincent had just revealed. The man he'd dismissed as just a waiter was actually the co-owner of one of the most successful restaurant chains in Northern California. 12 restaurants across the Bay Area, Vincent explained to the stunned audience. Annual revenue of $15 million, all built on Robert's investment and guidance after he left government service. Sarah Chen was frantically typing on her phone. The Heritage Club Group is worth approximately $40 million according to current market valuations. If he owns half, $20 million. Senator Hayes finished quietly, plus whatever other investments and savings from his government salary. The mathematics were devastating to Marcus's narrative. The worthless waiter he'd publicly humiliated was worth more than Marcus himself, despite Marcus's $8.5 million house and tech company success. But why? Catherine Moore asked her investment banker's mind, struggling to understand. Why work as a server when you could be running boardrooms? I set down my champagne bottle and straightened my vest one final time. After 20 years of invisibility, it was time to speak my truth. Because I wanted to understand people, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Government teaches you about policies and numbers, but serving tables teaches you about human nature, about what really matters to families struggling to celebrate anniversaries, about young couples planning their futures over dinner they've saved months to afford. Emma was crying now, finally understanding the full scope of her father's choices and sacrifices. I chose to be present for my daughter's childhood instead of chasing political appointments in Washington. I chose to build something meaningful with my hands rather than accumulate power for its own sake. And I chose to work alongside people like Vincent, who understand that success isn't measured by how much you can humiliate others. The last words were directed at Marcus, whose face had gone from pale to red with the realization of how completely he'd misunderstood everything. You see, I continued addressing the room, but watching Marcus. Some of us learn that true wealth comes from relationships, not bank accounts. That real power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. And that dignity isn't something you can buy or sell. It's something you earn through character. Vincent nodded with obvious pride. Robert could have bought and sold most of the people in this room. Instead, he chose to serve them. That's the difference between a great man and someone who just thinks he's great. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 of Silicon Valley's most powerful people sat in stunned recognition that they'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the revelation of a hidden identity, but a masterclass in genuine character and values. Marcus remained frozen at the head table, his cruel toast and arrogant assumptions lying in ruins around him. Everything he'd said about makers and servers, leaders and followers had been turned inside out by a man whose quiet dignity had just redefined what true success looked like. The silence broke as Senator Hayes stood up, his movement commanding the attention of everyone in the room. His face showed the kind of respect reserved for equals, not employees. Robert Mitchell, he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of congressional authority. It's been 20 years since we worked together on the Technology Infrastructure Act. Your economic modeling prevented what could have been a catastrophic market collapse. Dr. Wilson from the Federal Reserve rose next, adding his professional testimony. The monetary policies you developed for technology sector integration are still taught at the Federal Reserve training programs. Every analyst learns the Mitchell principles as fundamental economic theory. Sarah Chen was studying her phone with amazement. According to this financial analysis, your venture capital framework created the foundation for modern startup funding. Every unicorn company in Silicon Valley exists because of regulatory structures you designed. She looked up from her screen, her expression showing genuine awe. My entire career has been built on policies you wrote. Every billion-dollar deal I've funded used legal frameworks you created. Catherine Moore from Goldman Sachs shook her head in disbelief. The banking integration protocols from 1995, the international trade optimization models. We still use your mathematical formulas for risk assessment in technology investments. A gray-haired man I didn't immediately recognize stood at a corner table. David Peterson, former Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Robert, your work on NAFTA implementation saved American manufacturing while enabling the service economy transition. Brilliant analysis. The dot-com bubble prevention strategies, another voice added from across the room. You predicted the market correction 2 years before it happened and created the soft landing protocols that prevented economic disaster. Tech executive after tech executive shared similar testimonials. Policies that had shaped their company's regulations, that had enabled their innovations, economic frameworks, that had made their fortunes possible. Each recognition built upon the last, creating a cascade of professional respect that filled the room. Mr. Mitchell, a young entrepreneur called out, "My startup exists because of venture capital structures you designed. The regulatory environment that allows innovation to flourish. You created the economic ecosystem that built Silicon Valley." Even Marcus's own business success was directly traceable to my work. His fintech company operated under banking regulations I'd helped design. His venture capital funding came through frameworks I'd created. His entire fortune rested on economic foundations I'd built. The testimonials continued for 10 minutes, each one adding another layer to the revelation of just how fundamentally I'd influenced the world these people inhabited. Not just financially, but structurally. The very rules and systems that allowed their prosperity to exist. Emma watched with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding not just what her father had accomplished, but what he'd given up to be present for her childhood. The choice between power and parenthood, between legacy and love, between Washington influence and family presence. Marcus sat in stunned silence as his wedding reception became a celebration of the man he'd tried to humiliate. His guests were now giving a standing ovation to someone he'd called worthless, showing respect to someone he'd dismissed as insignificant. The complete reversal was devastating in its thoroughness. Every assumption he'd made, every cruel word he'd spoken, every arrogant judgment had been proven catastrophically wrong in front of the very people he'd most wanted to impress. As the testimonials concluded and the standing ovation finally faded, all eyes turned to Marcus. The confident groom who had commanded the room an hour earlier looked like a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. His hands trembled as he slowly rose from his chair. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. The boardroom authority that had made him millions had completely evaporated, replaced by the uncertain tone of someone who'd discovered they understood nothing about the world they thought they controlled. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened tonight. I misjudged you completely." The room remained silent, 200 witnesses to what was essentially a public confession of ignorance and cruelty. "I thought I understood success. I thought wealth and connections and influence were what mattered." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "I reduced you to a job title when you'd achieved the kind of significance I can only dream about." Senator Hayes nodded grimly from his table. Several other guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, their opinion of the groom clearly shifting as they processed the magnitude of his error. "You built the economic foundation that allowed my entire industry to exist." Marcus continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out before his courage failed. My company operates under regulations you designed. My fortune exists because of frameworks you created. And I called you worthless. Emma sat frozen watching her new husband's public humiliation while surrounded by the most influential people in Silicon Valley. This wasn't how wedding receptions were supposed to unfold. I don't expect forgiveness, Marcus said, his gaze fixed on me across the room. I just need you to know that I recognize how completely wrong I was about everything. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Marcus had gone from predator to prey in the span of an hour, his social standing in ruins among the very people he'd tried so hard to impress. But perhaps the most devastating consequence wasn't his damaged reputation. It was the look in Emma's eyes as she watched the man she'd married reveal himself as someone capable of such casual cruelty toward her father. Several guests were already whispering among themselves, and I could see phones emerging as people began texting about what they'd witnessed. By tomorrow, the story of Marcus Sterling's spectacular misjudgment would be circulating through every boardroom and country club in the Bay Area. Vincent stepped closer to me, his expression mixing satisfaction with something deeper. Some lessons, he said quietly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, are worth more than any amount of money. Marcus remained standing, perhaps hoping for some word of forgiveness that would salvage what remained of his reputation. But the damage was already done, and everyone in the room understood it. The wedding reception had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people by appearances, and Marcus Sterling would be remembered not as a successful groom, but as the man who publicly humiliated a legend. The silence stretched until Emma slowly rose from her seat, her wedding dress rustling as she moved toward me. The room watched as the bride walked away from her new husband and approached the father she'd watched endure public humiliation with impossible dignity. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. Tears streamed freely down her face now, carrying mascara in dark tracks that she no longer cared about hiding. "I'm so sorry." I set down my champagne bottle and removed my serving gloves, becoming Robert Mitchell, the father, instead of Robert Mitchell, the waiter, for the first time all evening. "You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart. I let him treat you like that. I sat there while he said those horrible things. I should have stopped him." Her voice carried the anguish of someone realizing they'd failed the person who mattered most. "You're not responsible for his choices, Emma. You never were." She looked around at the room full of distinguished guests, all of whom were watching our reunion with something approaching reverence. "All these years you let me think you were just a waiter. Why didn't you tell me who you really were? Because being your father was more important than any title I'd ever held." I reached out and gently wiped the tears from her cheek. Every policy I wrote, every economic framework I designed, all of it was just preparation for the most important job I ever had, raising you. But you gave up everything. The White House, the influence, the recognition. I didn't give up anything, Emma. I chose something better. I chose Saturday morning pancakes over Senate hearings. I chose helping with homework over congressional briefings. I chose being present for your first heartbreak over designing economic policy. Around us, the room had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to witness this moment between father and daughter. "Every choice I made was about you," I continued. "Working at the Heritage Club wasn't about hiding from my past. It was about understanding what really mattered for your future. Learning that success isn't measured by how much power you accumulate, but by how much love you give." Senator Hayes approached respectfully. "Mr. Mitchell, would you honor us with the father-daughter dance? I think everyone here would consider it a privilege to witness." The band, who had been waiting uncertainly in the corner, began playing a gentle waltz. Emma looked up at me through her tears, and for a moment, she was 5 years old. Again standing on my feet as I taught her to dance in our living room. "I don't deserve this," she whispered as we began to move across the floor. "You deserve everything beautiful in this world, sweetheart. That's why I've spent 28 years making sure you had it." As we danced, the guests formed a circle around us, but their attention felt different now. Not like spectators at a performance, but like witnesses to something sacred. The relationship between a father and daughter, tested by circumstances, but proven unbreakable by love. "I'm proud to be your daughter," Emma said quietly, her head resting on my shoulder. "Not because of what you accomplished in Washington, but because of who you chose to become for me. And I'm proud of the woman you've become despite everything you've had to navigate tonight." The dance continued as Vincent watched from the doorway, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a man who'd helped justice prevail. Around the room, phones were quietly put away as people recognized they were witnessing something too precious to document, too meaningful to reduce to social media posts. Marcus remained at the head table, isolated, and forgotten his perfect wedding, having become a celebration of values he'd never understood. The lesson was complete, the price paid, the truth revealed. When the music ended, the applause was warm and sustained, but it felt like gratitude rather than mere politeness. These powerful people had learned something about what true strength looked like, what real character meant, what genuine success required. As Emma and I finished our dance, I caught sight of the compass still sitting on the gift table, forgotten in the evening's drama. Tomorrow I would give it to her again, and this time she would understand its true meaning. Not just a family heirloom, but a symbol of the moral guidance that had led me home to what mattered most. The evening began to wind down as guests prepared to leave, but the energy had completely transformed from Marcus's original vision. Instead of a sterile networking event, it had become something much more meaningful. A reminder that character trumps credentials, that dignity defeats arrogance, and that love ultimately conquers all attempts to diminish it. As people gathered their belongings and said their goodbyes, many approached me with handshakes and words of respect. But the moment I treasured most was watching Emma's face as she realized that her father's greatest achievement wasn't any policy he'd written or any president he'd advised. It was the choice to put family first when the world was pulling him in a dozen different directions. Senator Hayes paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "Robert, the country could use your expertise again. There are positions available, influence waiting to be reclaimed." "My influence is here," I replied, glancing toward Emma, "building something that matters more than any legislation ever could." Dr. Wilson nodded with understanding. "The next generation benefits more from having fathers like you than advisors like us." Vincent appeared beside me as the last guests departed, his satisfaction evident. "You taught them something tonight they won't forget. That real power comes from knowing who you are, not from telling others who they should know." Marcus had left earlier with a few close friends, his damaged reputation requiring immediate damage control. The wedding reception he'd planned as his social triumph had become the story people would tell for years about the danger of underestimating quiet strength. For our older viewers watching this story, the lesson is clear and powerful. Your value isn't determined by your current circumstances or past achievements. True dignity comes from how you treat others, how you prioritize relationships over recognition, and how you choose character over convenience. Sometimes the greatest power lies in knowing when to step back and let your children shine while always being ready to stand up for what's right. The measure of a successful life isn't found in titles or bank accounts, but in the love you give and the principles you never compromise no matter how much pressure the world applies. Robert Mitchell had proven that some victories are worth more than any amount of money or status, and that the quiet strength of a father's love can overcome any attempt to diminish its value. The drive home felt different than it had 3 days earlier. Then I'd been a man excluded from his daughter's wedding, dismissed and humiliated by someone who thought he understood the world. Tonight I was returning as someone who'd learned that love and patience ultimately triumph over cruelty and arrogance. Emma's happiness had been preserved, though her marriage would require more work than she'd anticipated. Marcus had learned a lesson he'd never forget about the dangers of judging people by superficial standards. And 200 of Silicon Valley's most influential people had witnessed something they'd probably never see again: the complete triumph of character over circumstance. The compass would find its way to Emma eventually, but tonight's events had already provided the most important guidance of all. True worth comes from the relationships we nurture, the principles we maintain, and the grace we show when tested by people who mistake power for strength. Vincent would probably spend the next week fielding calls from guests who wanted to book events at the Heritage Club, drawn by the story of the owner who chose service over recognition. The restaurant business would flourish not because of my hidden wealth, but because people had seen authentic values in action. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I reflected on the evening's lessons. Marcus had tried to exclude me based on superficial judgments, never realizing that worth isn't measured by job titles or bank accounts, but by the content of character and the depth of love. The greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's living so well that your critics realize their own emptiness. Tonight had proven that dignity, patience, and authentic love will always defeat arrogance, cruelty, and false pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight belonged to the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be yourself, serve others with grace, and let truth reveal itself in its own time. If you enjoyed this story about the triumph of character over circumstance, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about Robert's choices in the comments below. Remember, the most meaningful victories often come not from fighting back, but from standing firm in your values until others recognize their true worth. For more stories about family dignity and the power of quiet strength, click the suggested video on your screen. Thank you for listening, and remember that your true value can never be diminished by someone else's ignorance or cruelty.